Okay.
Bible study hub night. You want to give us a intro?
We are in Acts chapter 21. We're going to hopefully finish that off tonight. Paul has been trying to get to Jerusalem for a long time, and he has just not been able to make it. And along the way, he keeps being warned by Christians and prophets, even, if you go, you're going to be severely persecuted. And they're saying, please don't go, please don't go. And Paul just last week, he was like, stop trying to break my resolve. I'm going to Jerusalem. God has told me to go. I'm going to go. I know I'm going to suffer, but I'm going to go anyway. So he finally gets to Jerusalem. And when he gets there, he is greeted by the elders of the church in Jerusalem, led by James, the apostle. And he's told that there's a bunch of Jews who've come to believe in Jesus as their Messiah, but they don't like that Paul is so easily welcoming Gentiles into the body of Christ without converting to Judaism first. So it's kind of making them mad. So instead of just coping with the fact that they're going to have to let Gentiles in and like getting their hearts right with that, they decide to make up all these lies about Paul and tell everybody, oh, he's telling Jews that we're not supposed to circumcise anymore, and we're not supposed to follow the law of Moses anymore, and all these ceremonial things that he's telling Jews not to do. That was not true. He was telling Gentiles, you don't need to do those things in order to be saved. But he never said that. I mean, I'm sure he said, like, you don't have to do this to be saved to the Jews, but he never told the Jews, don't be circumcised, don't celebrate the festival. Paul himself kept his Jewishness very much intact. So the elders are like, we've got a big problem here. All these people are upset. How about this? We know you're doing the Nazarite vow. We've got 4 other guys doing it. You guys go to the temple together. Paul, you pay for their dozen sacrifices or whatever it is. And we want you to show everybody by example that you're very much still Jewish. So that's kind of where we're picking up tonight. Paul says fine, he's going to do that. And so we're going to pick up in Acts chapter 21. It says, when the 7 days were almost completed, the Jews from Asia, seeing him, Paul, in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him, crying out, "Men of Israel, help! This is the man who is teaching everyone, everywhere, against the people and the law, and this place," meaning the temple. "Moreover," they go on, "he even brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place." For they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian with him, Paul, in the city, and they supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple. Okay.
What a situation.
We've got a situation. There's a lot to uncover here. Noelle, talk to us about, this is not our first riot that we've seen. This is getting to be standard fare. We were just in one in Ephesus not too many weeks ago. Now we're in one in Jerusalem. What's going on?
Yeah, these guys tend to do this a lot, is that, one thing happens and they just kind of work themselves into a frenzy. We have to remember the allegations that are being made are completely false, couldn't be further from the truth, charges against Paul. And I want to go over, you guys have just put in so many great reminders of the Nazarite vow. Let me go over those really quickly, because I think this will put into perspective just how far this is a vow that Paul is under at the time of this riot. This will put into perspective how far off their accusations are from what he actually did. Carolyn says you can't cut your hair. Lori says can't be near dead bodies. Shireen says it's a dedicated service to God in a really intense way, but temporary, usually about 30 days. Judy says not to go near a dead body, not to drink wine or raisins or grapes, shaved head. Yes, you're all spot on. So he is currently under this Nazarite vow, all of his normal Jewish customs maintained, but he's taking it to just sort of this additional level for a period of time, this additional level of intensity and piousness. So everything that these guys are saying to them is just wild, so far outside the realm of what you would expect. You'll remember we had some less than optimal scenarios happen previously with some rioting. That happened most recently in Ephesus. And there's reason to believe that the people who are stirring this up also are from Ephesus. So because they couldn't get him when he was in Ephesus, they're going to do it now. and hit it. When it says in verse 27, he stirred up the crowd, that literally meant throw them into a confusion. So we've just got another attempt to get a mob going, try to kill Paul, get everyone freaked out and angry. Probably most of these guys, they don't even know what they're rioting over, what they're mad about. All they know is that we're all mad right now, so we're going to just be mad. And then they accuse Paul. This is my favorite accusation, actually, because I think it's just the most on its face insane. They accuse Paul of bringing a Gentile, a Greek, into the temple. And Mom, Fry, for us, it's like, well, I mean, yeah, so he brought his friend in. So what? I mean,
right.
Man,
Inviting them to church.
Yeah, I know. Can't you guys all just be pleasant with each other and let that go? What's actually happening here? Why are they accusing him of this?
Okay. Well, the thing is that the temple had an actual outer court for Gentiles, foreigners, for Jews who might be ceremonially unclean, who are not permitted to go into the temple. When we talk about the blind and the lame, the people that might sit outside the temple and beg, they would have been allowed to be in the court of the Gentiles, I believe, but they could never go any further than that. So it was kind of like for all the unclean people, and the Jews would probably kind of scurry through that area pretty quickly to get into the actual court where they wanted to go. Noelle, could you possibly bring up a photo of a model? This looks so real. I want you to know this is a model that was built. It's amazing and beautiful, but it's not obviously to scale. But they think that this is kind of what it would have looked like. So you can see down on the right, the balustrade fence with inscriptions. Do you see that over on the right bottom? Mm-hmm. That is where the fences were that kept the Gentiles back. So Gentiles would never, ever, ever go through the little tiny opening doors you can kind of see every so often there, where they would remove like a pylon and you could go through. That's where the Jews would go through, but the Gentiles didn't dare. And the reason they didn't dare was because they would die if they did. In fact, we have a couple of artifacts. Noelle, if you want to pop one of those up. If you read Greek, you know what this says. I don't personally read Greek, but apparently it basically says Gentiles keep out under penalty of death. I'm sure I'm not quite word for word. There's another one that came from another time. In fact, the one you're looking at right now actually resides in a museum in Istanbul. It went all the way from the Temple Mount to Istanbul, which I think is really interesting. But anyway, so there were these inscriptions all over the place. They knew that the Gentiles could not go through those balustrades. They would be killed if they were. So the thought that Paul, who loves his friend Trophimus, I mean, Trophimus is with him for a long time. We read about him, I think, in 2 Timothy. We've read about him already in the book of Acts. He's Paul's companion. Paul would never put his life in jeopardy by escorting him right into the next level of the court. So it's a ridiculous charge. It's not true. There's no way it was true. And you can even tell Dr. Luke is like, yeah, well, they saw him with this guy. So they just thought, well, he probably brought him in. Well, let's read verses 30 to 31.
Find it. It says in verse 30 of chapter 21, then all the city was stirred up and the people ran together. They seized Paul and dragged him out of the temple, and at once the gates were shut. And as they were seeking to kill him, word came to the tribune of the cohort that all Jerusalem was in confusion. Here's our next mob scene. We have to remember when this is. So this is Pentecost, the Feast of Pentecost. There would have been about 2 million extra people in the city for this feast. So we assume that the people who are pulling into this aren't even from the area. They probably hadn't ever even heard of Paul. They didn't know what was going on. But just like in Acts 19, we've got a mob going. I want to pull up this picture one more time, actually. Let me show you again what this temple looked like, because I think, Mom, you can kind of put into perspective for us what it is, kind of position where we are in this story.
Right. Okay. So you see on the left where it says, the court of the Gentiles, you see those words. Noelle, can you just hover over the little canopy right under even better. Thank you. All right. You see where it's circled there? That was the chamber of the Nazarites. And so this is a place where if you were doing the Nazarite vow, you would go into this chamber as part of your purification. You would go on the 3rd and the 7th day of your purification. We think this was the 7th because it says it's at the end of it. So you can see the doors right under that blue circle. What we think happened was that they probably got Paul from that chamber and probably dragged him out of those doors into the court of the Gentiles. And the reason that they would do that instead of just kill him on the spot was because they didn't want to defile themselves by killing him in the temple. They would consider that a defilement of their temple. So to be upstanding citizens, they would take this innocent man on trumped up charges, drag him out, and then kill him. So this is a mob who plans to kill him. This has to be incredibly scary, even if you know you're going to suffer. This cannot feel good. I don't know if Paul thought he was going to die. He had been told by the Lord that he would stand before kings and governors. He's not done those things yet. So if he's thinking about that, he's got to be saying, I can't die yet because God's promised I'm going to stand before kings and governors. But in the heat of the moment, I don't know if that crossed his mind or if he's like, I'm going down here, Lord Jesus, here I come.
Oh, it's frightening nonetheless. And he would have been very beat up by these guys already. They're not being gentle with him, even though they're not killing him yet. This is not pleasant. I think what's really intriguing, the Roman colonel hears of it and he is on this like immediately, right away. He's ready to go. And the reason for this is that they would have been on high alert during the feasts. When you've got millions of extra visitors coming to the city, Rome just beefed up their security. They were like, we're not going to take any chances here. Let's bring in our guys. So a cohort, which is who's called in here, it's a group of about 1,000 men. This is this is a true army that he's bringing in. And then the leader of the cohort, his job, he oversaw 1,000 men, and his job was to just keep order during the population swelling during the feast time. And most likely, they would have been coming from a place called Fort Antonia on the south side of the temple. And I'm going to bring that up. Mom, walk us through the significance of Fort Antonia.
Yeah. And again, this is a model. This isn't for real, but it looks pretty amazing. So this fort was situated, as you can see there, it's on the right there. You can see the fort. And then to the left of that is what would be the temple. So they've situated this so that on especially feast weeks and holidays and things like that, they can really beef up their military. And you see all the windows up there. They could watch down on the temple grounds, make sure everything was going well. And if they needed to, they could literally shoot their arrows through those windows and take people out on the temple grounds. So when they needed to be on site, they would run out that little door, down the steps, around, and straight into the temple. So they could get in there extremely quickly. And take a look at those steps, because actually the steps are going to come into play here in a very interesting way in a few minutes. So take a snapshot in your mind of that. Yeah. So Noelle, why don't we just read verse 32, I think.
Yeah.
Just that one.
Yeah, it says he at once took soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when they saw the tribune and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. This is interesting. In less than a minute, you've got 1,000 soldiers on the scene, and the people instantly stop beating Paul. And no doubt this saves his life. Aside from just the obvious, like you get, 1,000 soldiers on the scene, like you're probably going to try to get out of Dodge. Why did everybody just cut it out at this moment, Mom? What was influencing their decision to calm down?
Well, they actually had something very much in the front of their mind at this moment, because 10 years prior to what's happening right here, Josephus, the Pharisee historian, he didn't write the Bible, but he wrote some fantastic extra biblical, meaning outside of the Bible, but still we assume truthful, accounts of all kinds of things that happened. So he wrote about something that happened 10 years prior to this, when they had Passover celebration, and he describes this one Roman soldier. I guess he exposed himself to the Jews and then just hurled all kinds of insults and expletives down on them. And you can only imagine the reaction of the Jews to this Roman soldier. So that precipitated this enormous uprising and revolt by the Jews. And the Roman soldiers immediately out of Fort Antonia were down to deal with it, and they dealt with it. But the Jews didn't back off. So the soldiers just literally trampled them. It was a really horrible, horrible scene. And Josephus says 20,000, maybe 30,000 were killed in the stampede. Most commentators feel like that's a pretty high number, and they're not totally sure if he was just kind of guessing high, but we don't know. So I think what we can say though is a lot of people died because they didn't back off when the soldiers showed up. So at this point, they're still thinking about this because it's only been a decade. So the minute they see those soldiers coming, they're like, hands up, we're good. Stop. We'll stop. So that's what they're going to do right now. Noelle, let's read verses 32 to 36.
Yeah, I'll just reread 32 quickly for you guys. Yeah. He at once took soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when they saw the tribune and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Then the tribune came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. He inquired who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd were shouting one thing, some another. And as he could not learn the facts because of the uproar, he ordered him to be brought into the barracks. And when he came to the steps, he was actually carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the crowd. For the mob of the people followed, crying out, "Away with him." Violent scene. Paul gets arrested again. Guys, this is so unfair. Paul's done nothing wrong. Everyone flipped out for no reason, beat him up, and then Paul's the guy who's going to get arrested here. It's like, come on, what are we doing, folks? We're going to talk about why this happened in a few moments, but this guy inquires of the crowd, not of Paul, what he did. He doesn't turn to the guy literally right next to him. It's like, what's this all about? He asks this actual mob rioting, and they're all just screaming. He has no idea what's going on. Again, unfair, but we'll explain this in a little bit. Crowd shouting, total mayhem. And because he can't figure out what's going on, he orders Paul to be bound, and he's bound with 2 chains. We've talked about this many times. Dr. Luke does not have a lot of space to write this. So any detail he's putting in here that seems extraneous or unnecessary, he determined to be a necessary detail. So I have to ask you, our Facebook Live audience, and if you're with us on YouTube, also comment your thoughts. Why does Dr. Luke go to the trouble of including the specific number of chains here? I want to see your answer. Why does he specify there were 2 chains that he was bound with? This is interesting.
These are the things that as we're reading through, Noelle and I, those are the things that jump off the page at us, and we start asking questions. For any of you who've ever been brought up in any kind of religious tradition that discourages asking questions, we do the opposite. We're like, how do you learn? You ask questions. So we see that and we go, he says 2 chains. Why the number 2? What is the significance? And because we know that the Bible is the absolute inspired, perfect, inerrant word of God, that God inspired Luke to put that number 2 down there. So there has to be a reason why.
Your comments are coming in. Emily says 1 for hands, 1 for feet. Carolyn says that too. Deb says that. Susie says maybe they're trying to extend his arm, sort of a similar position to crucifixion. Roberta, this is interesting. She says to show how difficult it would be for Paul to escape or break the chains, the intense security on this guy. I think those are all great answers. And I think they're all accurate in a very pragmatic sense. Mary says it's demonstrating how brutally he's being treated. I want to refer you back to last week. We talked about a prophet named Agabus who came in and he did something very specific. Mom, what did Agabus, this prophet, do when he encountered Paul?
We talked last week how we call these things sign acts, when a prophet will literally demonstrate or illustrate something that God is trying to communicate through some physical explanation or demonstration. So he took Paul's belt sash around his waist, which would have been very long. We assume he pulled his knees up and his feet, and he tied his hands and he tied his feet together. And he said, the man who owns this belt will have this happen to him in Jerusalem. His hands and his feet. So Emily and Deb and a bunch of you that said, well, I assume that would be one for the hands and one for the feet. I think you are absolutely right. And the reason that Luke said 2 chains is because he wanted us to think, oh, Agabus was right. He really is a prophet of God. Because remember, we said a true prophet of God has to be accurate 100% of the time. That is the biblical standard for prophecy, 100% accuracy. If Luke had just said, and he bound Paul and blah, blah, and then went on, right now we would be asking, do you think it was both his hands and his feet, or do you think Agabus was a true prophet or a false prophet? We wouldn't know. But by mentioning the number 2, we instantly know it had to be both his hands and his feet, 100% for sure. And Agabus's prophecy comes true. So at this moment, Paul has to be thinking to himself, well, they warned me. They warned me.
At least I knew it was coming this time, right?
Here we are.
It also explains, though, why it says when he came to the steps, he was actually carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the crowd. Mom gave a great, if not sort of funny, explanation to me of this. Have you guys ever been like a cheap shoe store where they tie the shoes together with that little plastic before you have to like waddle to try on the shoes? So yeah, you kind of do this little shuffle.
Like, are these comfortable? I don't know. I have no idea. I can only walk like a millimeter at a time. Welcome to Paul's situation. Now try to climb stairs like that.
Up all these stairs. You remember in that picture we showed you, there's that large staircase. The crowd is coming behind them at this point. They're still mad. They're still doing their mob things. And so because they're getting really violent and really aggressive, the soldiers are like, we don't have time for this guy to do his little shuffle up the stairs. And we also don't trust this guy. Clearly, they don't trust this guy. And so they pick him up, I assume, over their heads. And they just like rush him up these stairs and carry him in. And you also made a good point when we were talking about this earlier, that he's been pretty beat up by the crowd at this point. So I assume he's sore. He's got these chains on. He's being manhandled. I mean, how incredibly painful, at the very least uncomfortable, Paul must be during this situation. It's awful. Let me read verses 37 and 38 now. It says, as Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said to the tribune, may I say something to you? And he said, do you know Greek? Are you not the Egyptian then who recently stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 men of the assassins out into the wilderness? Whoa. Okay, so what just happened? So first, Paul turns to this guy and he's like, can I say something to you? And the guy's like, why are you speaking Greek to me? How are you doing this? Paul would have been fluent in Greek because of his fabulous education being brought up in Tarsus. Greek would have been widely spoken. He was highly educated. And so when he turns to this guy and starts speaking in Greek, the man is very surprised. He doesn't speak Hebrew, probably. He probably speaks decent Aramaic, but speaking Greek wasn't necessarily expected. So he's surprised by this. Paul's not speaking with any foreign accent. So it throws him off. And then he says something so strange, Mom. He says, are you not the Egyptian who recently stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 men of the assassins out into the wilderness? And you're like, what are we talking about?
Talking about
that?
Yeah.
This guy talking about what just happened. It's like hard left turn in this dialogue.
Again, we have to kind of go back into history to figure out what this is all about. And thank goodness for Josephus, because he's going to fill us in here. But before he does that, let me just say, we're starting to get some of the pieces of the puzzle together as to why this tribune, this Roman soldier, would arrest Paul when Paul has clearly not done anything. I mean, they're down there in seconds, if not in less than a minute. And the mob is going crazy and they're beating this guy up, but he has no way to defend himself. So he doesn't look like a guilty guy, and yet he's the one arrested. And we said a minute ago, like, why? Well, first of all, he doesn't know who he is, and we're about to find out who he thinks he was And the fact that he thinks he was this Egyptian guy tells us why he would immediately arrest him. So let's talk about the
mistaken identity here. That's
totally
very informative.
Yep. So this Egyptian Jew, according to Josephus, was an actual Jew from Egypt. Now, this is not somebody who was left behind when the Exodus happened way back in the book of Exodus, where the children of Israel were led out of Egypt to the promised land. That's not how that guy got there. There was a time in 586 BC when, as a judgment against Israel, the Lord allowed the Babylonians, foreigners, to come in and take them, and they exiled them. They took them out. And at that point, there was a huge dispersion of Jews. Some went to Babylon, but a lot of them just went other places. And they kind of migrated around the globe at that point, at least around that known world. So a lot of Jews ended up down in Egypt. And there was a huge population of Jews in Egypt, even up until 1948, interestingly enough. Unfortunately, 1948, some really horrible things happened to the Jews in Egypt. And to this day, there aren't many left down there. And that's really sad. But this guy had apparently probably been part of the dispersion that went down to Egypt a long time ago. And he's been there for a long time. He would not be expected to know Greek because he's from Egypt. So again, when Paul starts speaking Greek, this guy is like, whoa, who are you again? Because I wasn't expecting this Egyptian guy that I'm pretty sure you are to be able to speak that language. So anyway, this Egyptian guy convinces about 4,000 men of the Zealot party in Jerusalem to go with him to the Mount of Olives. By the way, the Zealots were like this political terrorist group. One of Jesus' disciples, Simon the Zealot, was part of this before he came to know Jesus. And then this Egyptian promised this 4,000 men that at his command, like he's some kind of Messiah figure, the walls of Jerusalem are going to fall down and it's going to be a free-for-all. Go in and make yourselves at home, basically, like loot the place to your heart's content. So when the Roman official, Antonius Felix, learns of this, he orders his soldiers to get their weapons and go in there and attack the Egyptian and all his peeps. And so they do. And they kill 400 and they take 200 as prisoners. So this is not too long prior to what's happening right now. However, they didn't get the Egyptian himself. The little wily guy, it's like Waldo. They can't find him. They're looking everywhere for him. And he's continuing to be a thorn in their flesh. Noel, take it from here and tell us kind of how he continued.
Yeah, on the show Jerusalem's Most Wanted, this guy was number one. So he's now working behind the scenes to stir up the people, to make war with the Romans, and he's telling everyone they should disobey Rome. So his whole the walls are going to fall down, we're going to invade Jerusalem didn't work, but this hasn't slowed him down. So even though he's not visible, this Egyptian is still a major thorn in their flesh. He's a major player in the Zealot party. The Romans want custody of him ASAP. In verse 38, it says he led the 4,000 men of the assassins. And it sounds like so fantastical. Like, who are the assassins? This is a Greek word translated assassin. It actually is the word sakari, and it means dagger men, which is worse than assassins, quite frankly. So he led 4,000 dagger men. The sakari were these political / religious zealots, and they were always out with the goal of assassinating and murdering their political enemies. So what they would do is they would target Jews who they thought were cooperating with or were supporting Rome, and they would carry these little small daggers in the folds of their flowy garments, and then in high population density area in crowds, they would get up close to one of these targets and then just stab them and kill them. What's particularly heinous about these guys is they'd get their little dagger out of their cloak, they'd stab and kill the guy and then be like, help, this guy, he's dying, oh no, who could have done such a thing, oh, and then just slink back into the crowd. And so they couldn't catch these guys, and it was really effective political warfare. People were dying. So with this background, it's horrible. It's so horrible. So with this background information, you can understand Rome is on high alert for this guy. Any indication they have that he's anywhere, they want to be on the scene. And presumably, they always had heightened military and security presence during festival times. But this year in particular, they're going to be on super high alert because they're looking for this guy. They want to get him. And so when the Jews start doing their thing in the temple, they're like, this is our guy, go get him. And so they go in with the assumption that this is the Egyptian who's led the 4,000 Dagger Men and tried to take over Jerusalem and causing all this problem. You can imagine when you kind of go in with that first impression, you've got all these people yelling. I mean, you can't hear anything. They're going to just roll with that. Everything at that point is just confirming what they believe about this situation. But when Paul opens his mouth and starts speaking Greek, this Roman official goes, uh-oh, the Egyptian that we're looking for would very, very unlikely, highly unlikely that he could speak Greek. And we have to also remember, Paul is so well educated. He wouldn't have had an accent. He would have been completely, fully fluent. He would have spoken like an academic. And this is not who this insurrectionist cult leader freaky guy is. And they're smart enough to know this. Let me read verses 39 through 40, because Paul is going to just really like solidify this, like, I'm not that guy. Paul says, I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no obscure city. I beg you, permit me to speak to the people. And when he had given him permission, Paul, standing on the steps, motioned with his hand to the people. And when there was a great hush, he addressed them in the Hebrew language. So Paul continues to impress. Mom, what's the significance of him specifying he's from Tarsus in Cilicia? He's saying this is no, obscure city. Why is he even mentioning that?
Paul was an absolute master at aligning himself with people that had positioned themselves as his enemy. So he would somehow, some way find a way to get himself on the same plane, on the same page with those people without ever compromising his faith to do it. So that's what he's doing here. We have this Roman official who would absolutely have high regard and huge respect for the city of Tarsus. It was known as like the university city. It was a prestigious place to be from. And Paul basically says, hey, I'm from there. I'm from the university class city. And then he has another card that he could pull right now, Paul could. And that is his Roman citizenship. And when I was reading, I was like, and here he goes. And he's going to say, and I'm a Roman citizen. And he doesn't. He doesn't say. He's holding that card, which is so brilliant. And we'll get to that. I don't know if we'll get to that tonight, but tonight or next week. But anyway, I just think, Noelle, that the fact that the Tribune agrees to let Paul address this mayhem situation, this chaos, this crowd that wants to kill him, he's like, yeah, go ahead and speak to them. I would love to know from our Facebook friends and our YouTube friends, comment below, why do you think this Tribune agreed to let Paul speak to this crowd? I mean, you would expect, I guess I would expect that if Paul said, I beg you, let me talk to the crowd, he would be like, are you out of your mind? First of all, good luck. They're not. Secondly, they just tried to kill you. And thirdly, we need to talk because there's a whole lot of information now that I know you're not the guy I thought you were that I probably need to find out. So I'm just amazed that he agrees to let this prisoner of his speak to the crowd. And I would love to know what your thoughts are as to why he decided, sure, let's do it.
Yeah, I think it speaks so highly too to just the immediate trust and common ground that Paul has found with this guy. Like, I'm sure there was conversation that Luke isn't mentioning here, and it was probably not nearly as brief as this, but man, in just a couple of moments, Paul has gone from being, domestic enemy number one to being like, yeah, have a speech. Yeah, podium's yours, take the mic, which is wild. It's so interesting. The Tribune, at least from my perspective, has no incentive to allow Paul to speak. And I'm just like, why would the Tribune even let that happen? There's, from my perspective, there's no upside for him here. Why is he allowing this to take place? So you brilliant people will answer that question for me. Bob says, because the crowd would reveal the status of Paul. Okay, I love this. This is very intriguing because I think, Bob, what you're saying is that if Paul's lying right now and he actually is the Egyptian and he's just like way smarter than any of them thought, when he starts talking to the crowd, it's going to become evident pretty quickly if he is who he says he is. Lori says, because the Tribune wants to allow Paul to make his case. Shireen says, oh, I like this, maybe a cover up for their mistake. They want to see if Paul condemns himself. They're like, oh, we just arrested the wrong guy. Okay, see if he does anything stupid. Like, yeah, let's see if he just like give him enough rope, he'll hang himself, let him talk. I love that. Emily says it was the only way to calm the crowd, to let them know he wasn't the Egyptian. Yes, absolutely. Roberta says maybe try to calm the crowd down so they do not have to deal with them. Also to see if Paul will say something to trip himself up. Sandy says to let the crowd see the real Paul. I love that because it's very reasonable that this Tribune would have been under the assumption that the crowd has made the same mistake he just made. Like, oh, the reason these guys are losing it is because they think he's this criminal dude. So if Paul, talks, he'll explain to them he's not the criminal. They'll all calm down and go back to whatever it is they do, and we can all go back on our lives. Obviously, the crowd did not believe that Paul was this guy. The people who stirred it up knew exactly who he was, but it's reasonable for this guy to think like, oh, there was just all a big misunderstanding, just a big mistake in identity. We'll let this very eloquent young man clear this up for him. And Zara says maybe his presence actually had an impact and his manner convinced them to give him a listen. I think, so this is also a piece that we can't forget, is that because the Holy Spirit is so active and so present in Paul's life and is just manifesting so clearly, I think there is just a magnetism to Paul that this guy, not knowing God, just can't explain. So when Paul says this, he's like, yeah, I do it. And it's just the Spirit of God working. Just as a really brief note, my translation says there's a great hush, and then he addresses them in Hebrew. Some other translations are going to say something else. Mom, what's going on there?
Yeah. Some of you might have it say Aramaic. So the deal is that Hebrew was like the religious language of the people. Some of them could read it. They didn't speak it a lot. I think they prayed in Hebrew and things like that. But the vernacular was Aramaic. That was the language that Jesus mostly spoke while he was walking around doing his teaching as well. So we believe that Paul probably flipped into not Hebrew, but into Aramaic, which would have been the common language of the people. And just again, as a note, here's this guy. I mean, this is how brilliant this man is. And this is how God has so providentially educated him, where he was brought up to speak fluent Greek with no accent. And then just like that, on a dime, he flips over into the heart language of the people standing around him and speaks to them in Aramaic in their very own tongue. I mean, this is amazing. I don't know how many of you speak more than one language fluently. I only wish I could put my hand up. My hand is down. I can barely speak English half the time.
Before we move on, I want to talk about one of our underlying premises that we always go over. And one of our premises is that this book that we're reading from the Bible is 100% accurate. It is without error. It is accurate, both factually accurate, historically accurate, geographically accurate. So if that's our premise, Mom, it sounds like there's inaccuracy here, because we just said, my text says he addressed them in Hebrew. And then you said, well, probably not Hebrew, it was probably Aramaic.
Oh, got it. Yeah. Actually, I did study that this week. Noelle, thanks a lot for giving me a heads up on that question. I would have that on the top of my mind. Off the top of my head, I can't give you the specific answers, but I did actually research that to make sure it was true. And all I can remember is that it's one of those things where they were so closely related that it was kind of like 6 of one, half dozen of the other as far as terminology goes, but they just felt like you could call it one or the other and it would be accurate.
Yeah. There's a lot of really nuanced items in this. And so when we talk about the accuracy and the inerrancy of the Bible, the reason that inerrancy premise is important is because if we don't have that premise, it's actually harder to understand this. When we think about who was going to be at the temple, how they were speaking, what Luke is actually indicating here, it is possible that he addressed them in Hebrew and in Aramaic in various respects. There's a lot of, closeness in the language. There's sometimes when it would be appropriate to use Hebrew, where you just wouldn't use Aramaic, particularly when they're quoting scripture. They would have always generally reverted to Hebrew, which it was originally written in. When they're just speaking conversationally, they're generally going to revert to Aramaic. And so one of the reasons that we can say, yeah, it's kind of like 6 and 1/2 dozen the other, the languages are not the same, but in the vernacular, they were often used sort of interchangeably in very religious settings. And presumably this would have been a highly religious setting. When he's quoting scripture, he's generally going to go with Hebrew. When he's just speaking, he's generally going to go with Aramaic. So
Perfect.
That's the really high level explanation of what's going on there. But I'm always very cognizant of being intellectually honest when things come up like that, because
Appreciate that.
It can be a little bit weird. I want to start 22 and we'll just get a little bit into this and then call it a day. If you remember the story of Saul's conversion, this is Paul's testimony of that day and what led up to it. So way back early in the book of Acts, we got this sort of abridged version of how Paul came to know Jesus and how he met Jesus. Right here, we're going to get more information than we've gotten in any of the previous accounts in the book of Acts. And Paul has been a free man for almost the entire book of Acts up until now. But from here until the end of the book, he's going to be imprisoned in one way or another. So that's interesting to keep in mind. Let me start by reading verses 1-3 with you. And this is Acts chapter 22. Paul says, "Brothers and fathers, hear the defense that I now make before you." And when they heard that he was addressing them in the Hebrew language, they became even more quiet. And he said, "I am a Jew, born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in this city, educated at the feet of Gamaliel, according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers, being zealous for God, as all of you are this day." Few points. We just talked, Paul is such a master at finding common ground with people who are ostensibly his enemies. And so these people who are standing in front of him, who hate him, he finds common ground with them and says, I was so religiously zealous, just like you are right now. We're the same. I get where you're coming from. If you remember what their complaint was, what they were accusing Paul of just a minute ago, they were saying he is telling the Jews not to be Jewish anymore. He's saying that they don't have to do these things. He's saying they're bad. He's claiming that you don't have to be circumcised, and he's bringing Gentiles into the temple, and he's doing all these things that a good Jewish person would never do, heaven forbid. And so he's going to start making this case by saying, not only is none of that true, I am incredibly pious as a Jew to this day. And he brings up his upbringing and his background because he was a disciple of one of the most revered Pharisees ever. And this was a guy by the name of Rabbi Gamaliel. You may remember early Acts, and then in the book of Luke, we talked about Rabbi Gamaliel. He was esteemed as one of the best rabbis in all of Jerusalem. And he was the prize student of Rabbi Hillel. So we've gone back another generation. There were basically two schools of thought in Judaism at this time. There was the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai. And these were two very esteemed, very highly regarded rabbis who held very differing perspectives on the world and very differing perspectives on Judaism. Shammai was extremely strict. He was extremely legalistic. And then Hillel was a lot more liberal and permissive. So a good example of something they would have disagreed on would be divorce. So Rabbi Shammai would have said the only time that you can divorce anyone is because of uncleanness due to sexual impurity. That's the only time. All others are not allowed. That's what's going on. And then Rabbi Hillel would say, well, if you say that you can only divorce because of uncleanness, burning dinner would be unclean. So that would count and be a reason to divorce somebody. And so you could say just way more permissive. One of my favorites that these two schools would go to town at is the question, because these were the issues that were apparently big at this time. The question was, should you tell a bride that she's ugly on her wedding day? And Rabbi Shammai, of course, his position was yes. In fact, you must tell her because you have a duty to tell the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. And Rabbi Hillel was like, no, all brides are beautiful. And so you can imagine Rabbi Hillel and sort of this Hillel school of thought was a little more preferred. It was a lot easier to deal with, and not going around telling the bride that she's ugly. People preferred it. So Rabbi Gamaliel sort of took over in his stead when Rabbi Hillel died. And so Rabbi Gamaliel would have been the premier rabbi to study under. He would have been like, if you could be a disciple of any rabbi, like Rabbi Gamaliel would have been the top of the top. He was the Harvard and the Yale and the Oxford of rabbis in this time. We talked about this in the book of Luke. It was very unusual. In fact, it just never happened for a rabbi to go choose his disciples. This is why Jesus was so wild and just kind of radical and revolutionary. He went out and he chose his disciples. He said, you will be my disciple. Come follow me. Generally, that's not how it worked. You would go to the rabbi and be like, Rabbi, this is my resume. I would very much like to be your disciple. And then he would either accept the student or most likely he would reject them. So the fact that Paul was a disciple of Rabbi Gamaliel meant that Gamaliel had accepted Paul. And as such, this would so enormously increase the standing and the prestige of Paul in the eyes of the Jews that he's talking to. They would have loved and esteemed Rabbi Gamaliel. And so you kind of have this transference of just authority and trust. Well, Rabbi Gamaliel really liked this guy. I really like Rabbi Gamaliel, so maybe this guy is okay. And this is a beautiful setup from Paul. And we're going to end here because the rest of this is just brilliant. We have to do it in one chunk next week. But Paul sets him up so perfectly by just aligning himself with them and saying, hi guys, I'm Jewish, just like you. I'm highly educated in the humanities and the arts and philosophy and religion. And number 3, I've been trained by your all-time favorite rabbi, the most revered of the Pharisees, your favorite rabbi. He's my guy. He trained me. I trained under him. You're going to love me if you love him. And so he's very nicely aligned himself with them, found this common ground. And this is where I want to end tonight. Anytime that we can find common ground, it always goes better. I love how Paul thinks about these things because he always recognizes that he's actually a lot less removed from his quote unquote enemies than everybody else looking on sees. He's always finding that common ground. As soon as he talks to the Tribune, who we just saw, he goes, hey, I'm from Tarsus in Cilicia. You know that place, right? You've been there. Oh yeah, we've got common ground. We're the same, right? He talks to these guys. He goes, I'm Jewish. I'm incredibly pious. I love your favorite rabbi, and he was my man. We're the same. And he finds this incredible, beautiful common ground in beautiful ways. And I love that. I love that about Paul. And I always seek to be like this myself because Paul never compromises on truth. He never compromises on what is right. And he never compromises on obedience to Jesus Christ, but he's also always seeking to love and align himself and find common ground with people so that he can bring them in. And I think that's That's so cool. It's something that I strive to do more of, and I try to do more of, and Paul is like the pinnacle of that. This was a fun one. This was a great one with so much history. I love the nights where we've got a ton of just historical context. Shout out to my boy Josephus for being such a great contemporary and writing such wonderful history of all the stuff that was happening in Jerusalem at this time. This wouldn't be possible without Josephus and the Spirit of God as well. I say that jokingly because the text itself has everything that we need to know in order to have a relationship with Jesus. But it's always a lot of fun to bring in that extra context to add just sort of depth and color to what's going on. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. Come back next week because Paul is going to give his testimony. It's going to be wild ride, my guys. You have to join. And in the meantime, go out, make good decisions, go be a light to the world. We'll see you next week. Bye.